On behalf of the Host Center for Buddhist Studies and our partner, the Humanities Center, it's my honor to welcome you this evening and to welcome our guest speaker, Professor Seishi Karashima, who is Professor of Sino-Indian Buddhist Philology at the International Research Institute for Advanced Pathology at Soka University in Tokyo, Japan, and currently Numata Visiting Professor in Berkeley. Professor Karashima completed his education at the University of Tokyo, at Cambridge University and at Freiburg University, and took his PhD from Beijing University, or Peking University, I think they prefer to call it, and is a scholar well known internationally for his philological investigations of Buddhist Sanskrit texts and early Chinese translations. His prodigious scholarly output includes, in addition to numerous articles, and when I look today, I see the count is well over 100, in Japanese, English, Chinese, Russian, German, and French. There are some probably other languages there as well. So there are many very important articles, and in addition to those, a series of books, and I might mention among them a glossary of Dhammaraksha's translation of the Lotus Sutra, a glossary of Kumarajiva's translation of the Lotus Sutra, a glossary of Lokakshema's translation of the Ashtasahasrika Prajna Paramita, and a critical edition of the same translation. And these may sound like very specialized and recondite studies, but in fact, as many of you know, we use them all the time. And we are constantly referring to them, and that, of course, is not just puff, but even yesterday, and up in the last few weeks in the class being taught by Professor Michael Radich here, I don't think there's any session that has not had multiple invocations of the name Karashima and consultation of his work. So these are books that I know from my own experience I'm constantly taking down. I don't think I use the works of any other scholar in the way I use your work. Professor Karashima is also the editor and principal inspiration behind a number of important series of publications, including Buddhist manuscripts from Central Asia, which is an attempt to complete the work on all the Sanskrit fragments in the British Library, and then commenced more recently Buddhist manuscripts from Central Asia, the St. Petersburg Sanskrit fragments. And so these are major contributions to our field. But my favourite is the series Gilgit manuscripts in the National Archives of India, facsimile editions. By my count, I'm not sure if I'm up to date, I just looked at my own shelves, 5 volumes published so far? Yeah. 6 is coming great, all right. So I mean, for many, many decades, we have waited for this to happen, for decent colour images of this crucial collection of manuscripts to appear in the public, and thanks to Professor Karashima's initiative, thanks largely to your initiative, we now have these amazing volumes, so we are all in your debt. And finally, I may mention a journal, the annual report of the International Research Institute for Advanced Pathology at Soka University, a huge mouthful, which we usually call Ari Riab in our field. This journal began to appear in 1998, and within 20 years, and I think it's largely due to your editorship of that journal, this has, in my view, become, I don't know if everybody would agree with me, but I certainly think so, the premier journal for Buddhist studies in Japan in the space of that time. It is, in fact, the only Japanese journal I have on my shelves at home, so that's some kind of indication of how I prize it anyway, and I think many of us do. So all in all, Professor Karashima has made a number of tremendous contributions to our field, and it's a great pleasure to welcome here tonight. Thank you, Seishi.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul Harrison, and for your very friendly and detailed introduction. about me. I feel very much honored and to be invited here and to be able to give a lecture in front of so distinguished scholars and young colleagues. Today's topic is Buddhism as a cultural bridge between India and China. And I have 3 photos, and at the end of my lecture, you will understand the relationship of these photos. At first, I want to introduce about the Gandhara. Maybe all of you know about it. In ancient geographical context, the term Gandhara referred to the entire Peshawar Valley in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. However, in terms of broader cultural similarity, especially in art forms or political or administrative limits, its expanded territory is referred to as Greater Gandhara, comprised of Peshawar Valley, Swat, Taxila, and Afghanistan here. But also in Khotan, the official document in Khotan was written in Gandhari using a Kharoshthi script from 3rd century until end of 4th century. And also in Karatepe, there are many Gandhari inscriptions found, and majority of inscriptions in monasteries are written in Kharoshthi and in Gandhari language. So the influence of Gandhara, our Gandhari, is quite vast. And so Buddhism, many of Mahayana scriptures are composed in Gandhara, and I think in Gandhari. And then from Gandhara, it through Bactria, and then spread to China. So later time through this way to Khotan, but the earlier time through Bactria. Yeah? So this is Prajna Paramita manuscript, Gandhari Prajna manuscript from Gandhara, which Professor Farooq and I published. This is very important text, and it starts with almost Evam Maya Shrutam, Rushi woven, Shruto Eka Samaye Bhagava Daya Gaha, that is Raja Guriha Viharati Gurijaude, that is Guritura Kuta Prabade Tatora Ho Bhagava Aishpa. Aishpa is Ayusmanta, Suhuti, not Subhuti, Amantureti Pati, something, and then Maha Sattva Pranya Paramitu Arabya, not Prajna Paramita, Pranya Paramitu. And the earliest Chinese translation of Prajna Paramita, namely Daoxing Banrejin. Banrejin, sometimes dictionaries read that how to say Borojin or Borojin, all of them are wrong. It should be read Banrejin, because all the pronunciation is Panya, and it goes with Gandhari, Pranya. But later, in later time, in Shenzhen, the time they changed the reading of pronunciation of Banru to Boru. So I read Banru, pronounce Banru. And this is also a transliteration of Tassa Agata. This is Gandhari form of Tathagata. And Tata Agata, that means Tata and Agata. And later, Jiqian translates as Ru Lai. Yeah. And this transliteration shows that Ru Lai, so coming, is interpretation in Gandhari. But there are also interpretation as going. So Tata Gata, that is Tibetan Deshin Sekpa. And many Chinese transliteration goes with Gandhari forms. So for example, the uposai, or the pronunciation uposak. Yeah, it is Gandhari, upoi. And this is Bhairavan, and Bhairavan is Vajrapani. And so on. And Maitreya, but Chinese is Millok. And there is a Gatera and at the end, Millok, and it goes with Bactrian Metraga and Gandhari Metrak, and so on, and Amitabha, and this is Nagasena, but in Chinese, Nasen, and Gandhari also Nasen. When Chinese translators transliterate, they just drop off the last vowel, and so, for example, this Nasen, but Gandhara Nasena, but the last vowel is drop off and Nasen, and others, so it's the same. So, with the spread of Buddhism to China and the translation of Buddhist scriptures into Chinese, Indian culture and ideology began to exert an enormous influence on Chinese culture, literature, art, medicine, astronomy, and so on, and further on all the other East Asian cultures as well. My mentor, Dr. Ji Xianlin, a professor at Peking University, one of China's best-known scholars and founder of Indology in China, once said, if you want to explore Chinese philosophy or history of Chinese thought, it would be very difficult without a knowledge of Sanskrit. If you want to understand Chinese culture, you have to understand Indian culture, because its influence on us is very deep. Just as modern European and American cultures and the English language have exerted great influence on China, Indian culture and language influenced it from the later Han to the Tang Dynasty. For this, I would like to give several examples. The concept of Tian, Shen, Long, and the like had been quite abstract in the pre-Buddhist traditional Chinese culture. However, under the influence of numerous Indian stories in the Chinese translation of the Buddhist text, where the expressions of Tian for Deva, God, Shen for Devata, deity, and Long for Naga, serpent demon, occur repeatedly and are depicted as human-like figures. The abstract images of Tian, Shen, Long, etc. changed significantly and came to be perceived as human-like earthly creatures with which people could contact directly and be intimate with. This can be clearly seen, especially in the genre of stories entitled The Tales of the Miraculous, or Jiguai Xiaoshuo, which were compiled in China during the Wei Jin and Nanbei Chao period. For example, Shousenji by Gambao in the 4th century. People in East Asia have continued to hold such images concerning Tian, Shen, and Long up to this day. The spread of Buddhism to China coincides with the time of the collapse of the Han Dynasty, which lasted approximately 400 years, and the consequent loss of the authority of Confucianism, which had enjoyed the position of the Chinese official orthodoxy under the Han Dynasty. In the following turbulent times of the Three Kingdoms, Sangguo, and 6 dynasties, Liu Chao, in which the dynasties changed frequently, people became very religious and began to think freely and independently, though they were tossed by fate of history, while at the same time freed from the authority of Confucianism. Perhaps this period can be called the era of religions and free thought. Due to the unrest and the collapse of the traditional view of the world, people searched for new models or ideas which would transcend the traditional Confucian model, that is Shonren, wise man. Buddhism came to China at exactly that moment when China was in this cultural chaos. Precisely because of this, Buddhism had a good opportunity to take root in China and eventually spread outwards. Diezi and the Prajna Paramita. In the chaotic but ideological free atmosphere of this era, Buddhism and Taoism strongly influenced each other. An example of this syncretism is the Diezi. This Taoist text is traditionally ascribed to Die Yuko, a philosopher of the 5th century BC. However, judging from its content and also linguistic expressions, it is more likely to date from the 4th century CE. As I have demonstrated elsewhere, a parable found in the Diezi concerning a skillful bowman and his masterfully shot arrows is nothing other than a borrowing from a translation of the Prajna Paramita, more specifically from the Fangguan Banrujin, translated by Zhu Shuran into Chinese in 291. So Diezi chapter of Confucius. Zuyu said, I laugh at the way Gongsun Lung fooled Kong Quan. Long said, a good archer can make the point of arrow behind hit the notch of the arrow in front. He shoots one arrow after another so that each catches up with the one in front. All the arrows stick together. When the first arrow reaches the target, none of them breaks off and drops, and the notch of the last arrow is still fitted to the bowstring, so that to look at them you would think there is only one arrow. Like this. A similar parable is found in the Fangguan Banrujin, translated by Zhu Shuran. It is as with a vigorous, powerful man who is good at archery. He shoots one arrow upwards to the sky. He then shoots another arrow toward the previous one. Thus, he shoots one arrow after another so that these stick together, and hence the first arrow would not fall to the ground. When he wants to make it fall, then he stops shooting another arrow. If he does not shoot any more arrows, the first arrow then will fall to the ground. As this parable is found also in the Sanskrit version and other Chinese translation of the same text, it is apparent that the parable in the Fangguan Banrujin is the original and that the Diezi borrowed it. This is an illustrative example of how Buddhism crept into Chinese culture and the intellectual world silently without being noticed. The Taoist canon, Taozan. Taoism is an indigenous religion of China composed of a mixture of various elements, namely Fanxian Dao, way of magic, and the immortal Fan Lao Dao, way of the Yellow Emperor and Lao Tzu, and a popular faith based on the religious beliefs of ancient China. Nevertheless, in the Taoist canon, the Taozan, we find numerous modifications of the Buddhist scriptures. When Taoists composed the sacred text of Taoism, which actually originated from pre-literate folk religions, they adapted the Buddhist scriptures and reorganized them. The Taoist texts thus were inevitably influenced greatly by Buddhism and the Indian culture. It is also pointed out that styles and conceptions of Chinese poetry were also influenced by those of Indian poetry, which are richly found in Buddhist translations. I am still in the process of investigating this topic. Influence of Buddhist text on Chinese vocabulary. The influence of Buddhist texts on the Chinese language was also very great. The activities of translating the Indian text into Chinese, which lasted nearly a millennium, led to the creation of a multitude of neologisms. Among the transliteration of Buddhist terms which are still being used today are, for example, for but. So as I said, the last vowel drops off, but, and it is translated as but, for, mala, yeah, more. And very few people noticed it. This man is a transliteration of mala, gallant. Again, the last vowel drop off, and L and N in China, many places, and confused, interchanged, and so it becomes a man. And chana, yakshana, or bodhi. Bodhi is a transliteration of Prakrit Paliya, Sanskrit Spatika, but Sanskrit Spatika is also Sanskritized form from Prakrit form. And lastly, the ta, this is stupa, and this is Chinese character ta. Ta is means stupa pagoda, specially coined to transliterate Gandhari tuva or tuva from or in the Aryan stupa. Yeah. So the last drop off and tub, and this Chinese character actually this part shows a phoneme up, and this part shows tap. So tap. But if we ignore this radical, this sign very similar with this stupa. Don't you think so? This part and stupa is very similar. Yeah. Also, everyday words such as 现在, present, Sanskrit Pratyutpanna, 过去, past, Sanskrit Atita, 未来, future, Sanskrit Anagata, generally, truth, Sanskrit Tattva, 世界. Why there is a 世界 means word? Because it's a translation of loka dhatu. Yeah. Or in yuan, causality, hate pratyaya, guobao, yeah, retaliation of actions, Sanskrit paravipaka, etc., etc. Well, originally Buddhist neologisms, which means that these words reflected the ancient Indian ways of thought. Influence of Buddhist text on Chinese grammar, verb plus E. Even Chinese grammar was inevitably influenced by the uninterrupted flood of Buddhist translations, which became popular among the Chinese people. As I have already demonstrated elsewhere, innumerable sentences with the structure verb, object, and E are found in the Chinese translations of Buddhist texts, while in pre-Buddhist classical Chinese, the phrase E plus verb was used. In most cases, especially in the early translations, the phrase verb plus E corresponds to gerund or absolutives in Sanskrit or Prakrit text. For example, shuo zi song yi corresponds to Sanskrit imagata vashtva, having spoken these verses. In later translations, the phrase verb plus E was used to render past passive participles in Indian text as well. This construction was first used commonly by Buddhists, but later spread to secular text as well, and was finally replaced with the verb plus aspect particle L in later Middle Chinese. While comparing his translations with the Sanskrit text, I came to notice that Jiro Jiachen, Lokakshema, 2nd century, one of the earliest Chinese translators, generally used the structure with a preposed object, namely a shift of the object to before the verb, in accordance with the word order of Indian originals, which are most probably composed not in Sanskrit, but in a colloquial language, namely Gandhari, a dialect of Gandhara. This convention was used especially when the object consists of multiple words. As a result, both in the earliest and early Chinese translations, we find innumerable sentences which preposed object preposed object being used with prepositions such as qi yong, qu, etc. Later, this usage became widespread. vernacular expressions in Buddhist translations. In Buddhist translations, we find countless vernacular expressions as well. It has been maintained that vernacular expressions were used in Chinese translation of Buddhist texts because they were used for the purpose of preaching to ordinary people. I had followed this well-accepted assumption until I read the translation of the Vinaya text dealing with monastic rules, which contain many stories to explain the background how the rules were created. These refer to Avadana or Jataka stories of the past lives of people whose immoral behaviors led to the setting of rules as well. A great deal of vernacular expressions and grammar are used in them. However, the Vinaya texts were only meant for monks or nuns, and it was forbidden for ordinary people and novices to read them. Then why do the Chinese translations of Buddhist texts, including the Vinaya text, contain a huge numbers of vernacular expressions? The reason is that stories, fables, and daily conversations had been used in the original text, which depict the daily scenes of that age. Therefore, when translating Buddhist text, the translator also incorporated the relevant Chinese spoken expressions of that time instead of resorting to literary Chinese, which was unintelligible for common people. Translations of Buddhist texts as linguistic resources. According to Zhu Qinzhi's statistics, which were made on the basis of Lu Chen's Xinbian Hanwen, Dazanjin Mulu, the number of extant Chinese translations of Buddhist texts made in about 900 years from the Mid-Eastern Han Dynasty, mid-2nd century, to the Northern Song Dynasty, the 11th century, and transmitted up to this day is as follows. 1,482 texts in all, 5,702 juans or scrolls altogether, about 46 million characters. Thus, the amount is huge. Also, the dates of these translations can be clearly seen in most cases, and moreover, the database of the whole Chinese canon as well as images of various editions are all available on the internet. We can compare them with the Sanskrit, Pali, Gandhara, Tibetan versions, most of whose data are also available on the internet. Therefore, the Chinese translation of Buddhist texts offer us an irreplaceable, richest source not only for the research of Buddhism, philosophy, the history of thought and culture, etc., but also for the research of Chinese vocabulary, grammar, and phonology. Sanskrit and the birth of Indo-European linguistics. I think that when doing research, the most effective way is comparison, especially when the object of research is language. For example, the birth of Indo-European linguistics had much to do with the rediscovery of Sanskrit by Europeans. The British initially thought that Sanskrit and other Indian spoken languages were just indigenous and primitive of their colonies. Only after William Jones, a British linguist and Orientalist, published a book entitled The Sanskrit Language in 1786 and made it clear that Sanskrit has a homologous relationship with Greek, Latin, and Persian, did linguists in Europe finally begin to explore the relationship among Indo-European languages, and thus Indo-European linguistics came into being. Sanskrit and the birth of Chinese linguistics. Sanskrit not only had a significant impact on the emergence of Indo-European linguistics, but also on the advent of Chinese linguistics. Buddhism spread in the Han Dynasty around the beginning of the 1st century CE. Among the Buddhist monks who went to China from Bactria and India, here in India does not refer to the present India as a nation, but the area of ancient Indian culture, including current Pakistan, Nepal, etc. There must have been those who were born into good families, being well educated since childhood and proficient in Sanskrit. Sanskrit was an artificial language of intellectuals, as Latin was for pre-modern European intellectuals. Chinese people who had contact with such monks might have come to observe their own mother language, namely Chinese, objectively, in the light of foreign language, namely Sanskrit. Fan Jie. In pre-Buddhist classical Chinese, the pronunciation of an unknown character was represented by another character with the same or similar pronunciation using a method such as A, Du-Ru, or Du-Ruo, B. A is pronounced like the character B. For example, Long, Du-Ruo. Long is pronounced like the character Long. Thereafter, at the end of the Eastern Han Dynasty, a new system, Fan Jie, was created, which is a method of representing the pronunciation of an unknown character by means of two other characters. For example, Long, Di, Dong, Fan. Di is for the initial L, and Dong is the final On, that is Long. In the Wei Dynasty, Sun Yan systematized this method in his Arya Yinyi, which is considered traditionally to be the beginning of this method. Fan Jie was probably inspired by Sanskrit letters, aksharas, consisting of a vowel or a combination of a consonant and a vowel, and by a highly developed and sophisticated Indian phonology, which Bactrian and Indian monks might have introduced into China. It can therefore be said that true Chinese phonology began with the creation of Fan Jie. Dharani Toloni. In the Buddhist scriptures, many Dharani's magic formulas are found, except for a few translators such as Jitian, 3rd century, and Dharmalaksha, 4th century, 3rd century as well, who translated them. The rest used transliterations. A dharani can only be magical if it is pronounced correctly. Therefore, these translators must have carefully examined which Chinese characters to be used for which Sanskrit or Gandhari syllable and selected them accordingly. It is quite probable that Indian monks and Chinese translators collaborated together to do this. In order to ensure the correct pronunciations of Dharanis, monks often wrote small Chinese characters next to the Chinese transliterations, indicating their correct pronunciations. In my opinion, these practices also inspired Chinese to analyze their own language phonetically. Indian alphabet and Seishi Karashima. As research on linguistics and grammar were highly developed in India at that time, Buddhist scriptures often reflected the linguistic interest of Indian people as well. Thus, in several Mahayana scriptures, such as the Raja Prajnaparamita, Avatanshaka Sutra, and the like, there are a list of the Gandhari alphabet consisting of 42 letters called the Alapachana due to the order of the letters Alapachana. While in the Mahayana Mahaparinirvana Sutra, etc., we find the Sanskrit alphabet consisting of 50 letters. These lists must have inspired the Chinese monks and intellectuals alike to analyze the Chinese language phonetically. And finally, at the end of Tang Dynasty, a monk called Shouwen established a list of 36 letters, Sanshi Liu Zumu, which represented the 36 different initials, that is 35 initial consonants and 1 initial vowel of all Chinese characters. This list is used even today. Incidentally, the word Zumu letter, literally, letter mother is a translation of Sanskrit matrika, which means mother and any alphabet or letter. Therefore, it is clear that Buddhism paved the way for the emergence and development of Chinese phonology. Interestingly, the order of the syllables letters in the Japanese alphabet, a, I, u, e, o, kusu, tu, nu, and p, and mu, i, ru, v, n, originated from Sanskrit. And it is the same, and Tibetan is the same, but in the case of Tibetan, a, I, u, e, o comes at the last on the table. And also, Hangul is related with Brahmi. Yeah. Chinese lexicography. Great contribution made by Chinese monks are not only limited to Chinese phonology, but also include research on Chinese vocabularies. Original Buddhist texts from which Chinese translations were made had been produced mainly in and around India, including various places in Central Asia such as Bactria and Khotan. The translators created a large number of neologisms in order to express the ideas, concepts, and things which were unknown in China at that time or added new meanings to already existing words. The original texts were often replete with legend, fables, and daily conversations which portrayed everyday scenes which were hardly mentioned in pre-Buddhist Chinese texts. Therefore, when translating Buddhist text, the translator also used the relevant Chinese spoken expression of that time. The technical terminology and vernaculars found in Chinese translation of Buddhist text set obstacles for us to understand them correctly. Sometimes translators or their assistant added note in the text, for example, Wenshu Shiri Hanyuan Ru Shou. Wenshu Shiri meaning soft-headed in Chinese, and Manju Shiri meaning soft-headed in Chinese, in Ji Qian's translation of the Vimalakirti Nirdesha. There are also cases where comments and explanations by learned monks who lectures on Buddhist texts were added between lines in them. Finally, compilations of glosses on particular texts, namely Fojin Yi pronunciations and meaning of Buddhist scriptures, were made. Ichejin Yi. Later Chinese Buddhist dictionaries called Ichejin Yi pronunciations and meanings in the whole Buddhist canon, which explain the pronunciations and meanings of unusual and difficult words, as well as transliterations found in all Chinese Buddhist translations, came to be compiled one after another. According to the Datan Neidian Lu catalog of Buddhist texts of the Great Tang Dynasty, etc., we find Ichejin Yin pronunciation in the whole Buddhist canon not extant by Dao Hui, a monk of Northern Qi dynasty in 6th century. Zhongjin Yin pronunciation is many Buddhist scriptures not extant by Ji Qian, a monk of the Sui dynasty. Ichejin Yin by Xuan Yin, who participated in the translations of Xuanzang. Ichejin Yin by another Tang monk called Huilin. And Xu Yiqiejin extended pronunciations and meanings in the complete Buddhist canon by the Liao dynasty monk Xilin, which glosses on words found in the translations made after Huilin's Yiqiejin. These last three dictionaries not only contribute greatly to the study of Buddhist texts, but also provide a large number of valuable reference materials for later studies of Chinese logography, phonology, philology, and manuscriptology. These Ichejin are still of great research value to this day. However, it should be noted that although Xuan Yin's and Huilin's knowledge of Sanskrit was unquestionable, their understanding of Prakrit, that is, colloquial languages, including Gandhara, was almost zero. Language is used in Buddhist texts. Here we shall see briefly the history of languages used in Buddhism. From the time of Shakyamuni Buddha until around the 2nd, 3rd century CE, the Buddhist scriptures were transmitted orally at first and written later, not in Sanskrit but in Prakrit, colloquial languages. Shakyamuni himself probably preached in Old Magadhi, the dialect of Magadha, and encouraged his disciples to use colloquial languages in their sermons. So in Magadhi, the word of mother is pronounced as Maya, not Mata, not Mata as Sanskrit, but Maya. So Maya, my mother. Then this Maya was misunderstood as proper name, Maya. So Buddhist communities and those who listened to these sermons were not always particularly intellectual, but merely ordinary people. If the Buddhist teachings were preached in a formal, elaborate, and high-class language, such as Sanskrit, such people would not understand them. Therefore, the use of colloquial languages was inevitable and necessary. I have written elsewhere how the shift of languages and the ways of transmission of the so-called Mahayana Buddhist scripture took place. Namely, first, oral transmission in Prakrit, including Gandhari, 1st century BC. And second, oral transmission in Prakrit, writing of Prakrit text in Kharoshti, 1st to 3rd century CE. And third, broken Sanskrit mixed with Prakrit, 2nd or 3rd century CE. Here Prakrit means including Gandhari. And finally, Buddhist Sanskrit writing in Brahmi, 3rd, 4th century CE onwards. Gandhari as original language of early Chinese translation. It was probably not before the 3rd or 4th century CE that the oral Buddhist scriptures came to be gradually translated from Prakrit into Sanskrit. Thus, the underlying language of Lokakshema's translation of the Mahayana scripture was most probably Gandhari. Also, many of Jitian's and Dharmaraksha's translations were probably made from Gandhari or Gandharicum Sanskrit originals. Even the underlying language of the Chinese translation of the Dirgha Agama and the Dharmaguptaka's Vinaya, both translated by Buddhist and Zhufonian at the beginning of the 5th century, was a mixture of elements of Sanskritization, Prakrit, and local dialect as well as Gandhari. Xuanzang, Xuanyin, Huilin, etc. did not know Gandhari. In the Gandhara region, the Gandhari language seems to have died out by the 4th century. By the time of Xuanzang, and so 7th century, and Xuanyin, namely 7th century, the majority of Buddhist texts either had been translated already into Sanskrit or composed in Sanskrit from the start. Therefore, it is natural that they and their successors, Huilin, Shilin, did not know that original language of many of the earlier Chinese translations, Gui, before Kumarajiva's translation were colloquial, especially Gandhari. Xuanzang and Xuanyin tried to explain everything by Sanskrit, which resulted in misinterpretations. Nonetheless, solely basing their knowledge of Sanskrit, they forced themselves to explain difficult words and transliteration found in the earlier Chinese translations composed from the original in colloquial languages. This practice inevitably resulted in many misunderstandings in their interpretations. Moreover, it is problematic for us that these interpretations have been accepted as authoritative without doubting them, because everybody knows that Xuanzang was the great master of Sanskrit of his time and thinks that his assistant Xuanyin must have possessed an excellent knowledge of Indian languages as well. Misinterpretation 1, Guanxin. Here I shall quote some instances of their misinterpretations. In his Datan Shiji, Xuanzang wrote the following note on the transliteration of Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva. Avalokiteshvara is Guan Zizai, one who has sovereignty over observing in Chinese. It is a compound of two words joined by a sandhi. The Sanskrit form is as quoted above, here, Avalokiteshvara. If one analyzes the compound by dividing it, it consists of Avalokita, which is translated as Guan observes, and Ishvara, which is translated as Zuzai. In all the translations, this word is translated as Guan Shi-in, sound of word of light. Guan Shi-in, one who observes the sound of word. Or Guan Shi Zuzai, one who has sovereignty over observing the word in Chinese, all of which are mistranslations. In his Ichejin-ye, Xuanyin follows Xuanzan's comment. Guan Shi-in Avalokiteshvara in Sanskrit, which means Guan Shi Zuzai, sovereignty over observing in word in Chinese. In all the translations, this word is translated as Guan Shi-in, one who observes sound of the word, or Guan Shi-in, sound of the word of light, both of which are mistranslations. Neither Xuanzan nor Xuanyin knew that the old translations were made from an older form, Avalokita Svara, which is attested in old Central Asian Sanskrit fragment. As Ava could mean light, in Gandhara, Dharmalaksha analyzed this name as Ava, light, plus Loki, or Loka, word, plus Svara, sound, and rendered Guan Shi-in, sound of the word of light. After his death, his assistant, Nie Daozhen, replaced Guan, which had been based on Dharmalaksha's peculiar interpretation, with Guan observes, which corresponds to Avalokita, observes, and thus the popular name Guan Shi-in, one who observes sound of the word. Avalokita, again Loka, and Svara was coined. Much later, a new form, Avalokiteshvara, started to appear around the 6th century in Buddhist scriptures. At first, it was rendered as Guan Shi Zuzai, one who has sovereignty over observing the world, a mixture of old name Guan Shi-in with a new element Zuzai, after which Xuanzan made another new translation, Guan Zizai. Therefore, the old rendering Guan Shi-in and Guan Shi-in are not mistranslations. Their original form were not the new form Avalokiteshvara, but an older form Avalokita Svara. This Svara could be understood as thought from Sanskrit Smala, as well as sound in Gandhara, and the more original understanding of the name could have been one who observes thought of people. Thus, the criticism of Xuanzan and Xuanyin toward the old renderings result from their lack of knowledge of colloquial languages. Second example, the next example is Xuanyin's misinterpretation of the word Yulampen, widely known as Ghost Festival. The meaning of Yulampen has been largely discussed for more than a century, and a vast number of articles and books dealing with this mysterious word have been published. All the confusion surrounding its meaning stems from Xuanyin's misinterpretation of it in his Ichejin-yi. His explanation of this word is as follows. Yulampen, this word is corrupted. The correct form is Ulampo na, meaning hanging upside down. According to Indian custom, on the Pravarana day of the community of monks, lay people prepare grand offerings and donate them to Buddhist monks in order for their deceased ancestors to be saved from the agony of being hung upside down. And he also said, traditionally, it has been said that Yulampen is a vessel in which to store food. This explanation is wrong. In modern times, Buddhist scholars have been speculating for the last 130 years about the Sanskrit form of Ulampona, trusting Xuanyin too credulously and without reading the text itself carefully. modern theories concerning Yu Rampen, which are premised on his dubious reconstruction, are unfounded. As in the text itself, it is said that those who wish to practice filial piety should place food and drink of 100 flavors in yuram bowls. Therefore, it is evident that Yu Rampen is a sort of vessel in which food is placed. I assume that Yuran is a transliteration of a Middle Indic form Orana, again the last vowel drop of Oran, from Sanskrit Odana, boiled rice, and Yu Rampen, which may mean a bowl for boiled rice, that is a rice bowl. Odana in this compound was probably transliterated in order to designate that this was no ordinary rice bowl but one specially used for this ceremony. Consequently, the original title of this scripture, the Yuranjin, might mean Odana Sutra, or the Sutra of Boiled Rice, while the Yurampenjin could be the Sutra of Rice Bowl. Also, I assume that this sutra is not apocryphal, but rather a translation from an Indian text translated by Dharmaraksha or somebody else in pre-Kumara Jiva times. Third instance of misinterpretation. Xuanyin's etymological explanation of Manao misses the point as well. He writes as follows: Manao, in Sanskrit, Musala Garba. Musala means pestle in Chinese. Garba means storehouse in Chinese. It means embryo as well, referring to its solidness. In the past, it was also called Masala Garba or Musala Garba. It is translated as Manao. I assume that it is called so because the color of this precious stone resembles at times that of horse's brain. Yeah, it is here, right? So, thus, Xuanying interpreted Manao as a translation of Musala Garba, amethyst, and commented that it was called so because its color resembles horse's brain. I don't think that the color of horse's brain differs from a human being's brain. This strange explanation is used even to this day. However, in actual fact, Manao is a rendering of Sanskrit Ashuma Garba. Ashuma means Ashmat, the stone. Yeah? And its variant form Ashubha Garba, as found in older manuscripts. An ancient Chinese translator probably interpreted this word as consisting of Ashubha, horse, and Garba, womb. And so translated is as Manao, meaning literally the brain of horse. He may have translated Garba as now because the shape of brain resembles an embryo in the womb. Chatra. Xuanying also interpreted Cha, the multi-storied disc-shaped structure atop a stupa, as a transliteration of Sanskrit kshetra, and set out a detailed speculation about this word. However, as I have pointed out elsewhere, Cha is a transliteration of Sanskrit chatra, umbrella, a disc-shaped structure atop a stupa. As the history of these words illustrates the transmittance of Indian culture to China and from there further to Korea and Japan, I shall introduce it here in details. In ancient India, there was a custom in which an attendant carried an umbrella not only to save the king or a nobleman from the sun, but also to symbolize his power. Consequently, there is a Buddha statue over which an umbrella was placed to express people's respect toward him. Out of the same respectful feelings, multiple umbrellas were placed on a stupa, this is stupa, which was supposed to hold Buddha's relics. Here also. So this is not the mushroom, but the umbrella, chatra. Yeah. and here also a drawing. Umbrella, which had been placed next to each other on a stupa, as we have seen, later became the layered circular umbrella-like disc on the dome of stupas. Yeah. This is chatra, or umbrella. And here, these are chatras. The umbrella, and here also, these are chatras. Cha. In Chinese Buddhist text, cha, chat, correspond apparently to the word chatra in Sanskrit version. However, this identification is not without problems. Chinese translators principally use Chinese characters with the initial consonant Middle Chinese ch to render the Indian consonant kshu. For example, yue cha, that is yaksha, ye cha. That is also yaksha or chanti, that is kshanti. Whereas the Indian consonant cha was rendered into Chinese with the initial consonant Middle Chinese ch. For example, channu, channo, di cha, di chabi, etc. Therefore, it was quite natural to use cha as a transliteration of Sanskrit kshetra, no problem. Then why was the same cha was used to transliterate chatra, an umbrella? Although the reason is not yet clear, Sanskrit chatra was rendered often as kshatra in Central Asian languages. For example, Khotanese kshatra, so-called Toharian kshatra, kshutra. Moreover, in a Sanskrit fragment of the Svarnavasa Uttama Sutra, discovered probably in Khotan, Kshatra stands for chatra. Therefore, I assume that in mother language of the Central Asian translators, Central Asian translators of the Chinese Buddhist scriptures such as Kumarajiva, Sanskrit chatra was pronounced in the same way as kshatra, and hence it was transcribed as cha. The record of Buddhist monasteries in Luoyang Cheranji, compiled by Yan Xuanzhi, provides us with a rich source of descriptions of stupas in the Northern Wei dynasty, whose capital was Luoyang. I shall quote some descriptions of these below. In Yonnin Temple, there is a 9-story Buddha stupa, which is built with a wooden frame 900 feet high. On its top, there is a layer of cha, that is disc, chatra, which is another 100 feet, so that stupa itself is 1,000 feet high in total. Though being 100 li away from the capital, it can still be seen. On top of the layer of chas is the golden base with a capacity of 25 basels. In Chanchu Temple, there is a 3-story Buddha stupa. The gleam of the golden dish for collecting dew and the auspicious chants, the discs on it, can be seen throughout the city, that is Luoyang. Futon Temple, there is a 5-story Buddha stupa. A layer of golden chants rises prominently, like this. Yeah? A temple in which a multiple-story stupa was built was extremely rare. Only major and large temples could afford to possess such stupas. Cha, that is discs or golden cha, signify that there was such a stupa in the temple and that the temple was large and significant. Therefore, a major temple came to be called Mincha, famous temple, Gucha, old temple, Jucha, huge temple, Sucha, temple, Focha, Fancha, Chancha, etc. A temple without such a stupa was not called Mincha. Yeah. These are Mincha, because there is a stupa and there is a cha, discs. Recently, 3 articles concerning the etymology of Old Korean chol and Old Japanese tera have been published, namely by Beckwith and Bobbin and Sagart. Beckwith's hypothesis that Chinese character S was used by Central Asian Buddhist translators to transliterate the Aramaic dera or tera monastery is purely fantasy. The character Su was used to denote a government office which handled foreign guests and diplomatic delegates. Such an office was named Honru Su from the 6th century onward. It would also host Buddhist monks from Bactria and India. Probably a guest house built for such monks was consequently called Su and became to be designated as Buddhist temple. Bobbin and Sagart hypothesizes that Korean chol and Old Japanese tera originated from Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit Chaityan, which is phonetically impossible. Also, Chaitya does mean a shrine found outside, usually outside, or sometimes within a monastery or temple, but never means a monastery or temple where monks live itself. The final T of archaic Chinese generally changed to L or R in Sino-Korean. For example, E, so it becomes Korean il, or B, pyet, become Korean pil. In the same way, Chinese character cha, that is the old pronunciation chat, became Middle Korean chol, from which Old Japanese tera was derived. As we have seen, cha was originally used to transliterate chatra, which was pronounced probably in the same way as kshatra, and later cha came to signify a large and significant temple in which a multi-story stupa was found. Therefore, I surmise that the Middle Korean chol and Japanese tera are derived quite probably from cha, meaning a large and significant temple. One of the greatest differences between Buddhism and Christianity and Islam lies in the attitudes toward the languages of their scriptures. In other religions, the sacred texts were often not permitted to be translated or to be translated in vernacular languages, or translation have not been regarded as sacred. In Buddhism, however, any scripture, whether in Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, Thai, or in Japanese, is a sacred scripture. On this point, we Buddhists must thank Shakyamuni Buddha, who encourages his disciples to use each own language, Saka Nirutti, to give the teachings. This attitude concerning languages is one of the major reasons why Buddhism became integrated into many Asian regions and cultures gradually, silently, and pacifically. Buddhism adapted itself to the circumstances at hand without aggressively or arrogantly imposing its own teachings, tradition, or languages on the other cultures. Buddhism also played a role in bridging Indian and Chinese cultures. Through Buddhism, not only Indian materials, but also ways of thinking were introduced into China at times without being noticed. For example, as stated above, the expressions which originated in India, such as xianzai, present, guoqu, past, weilai, which were ingrained into Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. Also, the doctrine of transmigration, which again originated in Indian secular culture, though Shakyamuni himself, as well as early Buddhism, did not hold with this idea, has long been rooted in East Asian thought. Nowadays, nationalism is rising everywhere. I should like to clarify by philological ways that since ancient times, Asian countries have always been inseparably connected especially through Buddhism and have enriched their own cultures by humbly learning about the Buddhist culture of other countries. Therefore, China learned from Indian culture, Korea introduced Chinese Buddhist culture, as Japanese introduced Chinese and Korean Buddhist cultures. The transmission of Indian chatra, Chinese to Chinese cha, and Korean cho, Japanese tera, illustrate this perfectly. Now you know, you understand the relationship of these three photos. Thank you very much.